the notion that, that all of us live in the same world, and that distance and duration and the feel of things and the appearance of things is something constant. This was absolutely shattered, and I would say it was shattered in a flash by seeing these people who obviously lived in a way in extremely distorted worlds, and often fantastically distorted worlds, with all the distortions which one finds in Alice. It was very much an Alice-like wonderland.
At 30, Lola Rosinski was an active housewife. 6 years later, rigid and almost speechless in hospital, she wrote, "I'm finished. There's nothing else to do."
I can't do my hands even. I can't do my hands.
Lillian Wagner has developed over 2,000 compulsive and elaborate tics. They come every afternoon, and each day they're different.
I can't do my hands even. I just spoke up, you know. I can't do clear eating nose. My speech is not clear no more.
One night in 1926, Sylvia Schneider dreamed the world had come to a stop. She dreamed she was a living statue of stone. By morning, the nightmare had come true. Like Lola and Lillian, she was a victim of the strangest epidemic of our time. The first alarmist reports of the new disease came at the end of the Great War. All over the world, doctors were as baffled as the press. They named it sleepy sickness after its commonest symptom, a trance-like state which often overcame its victims for years. In Switzerland, a bride fell asleep at the altar. In France, not even childbirth could rouse one mother. As the epidemic spread, other symptoms multiplied. Parents were horrified to find their children's personalities changed overnight. Doctors reported schoolgirls becoming troublesome brawlers. One victim wrote, "I feel certain that we have all been given another character, and that our own died in our sleep." But the more seriously affected suffered only a short agony. Within a few weeks, patients could scarcely talk or swallow. They became emaciated and soon died. More than 1 million during the early 20s. No cure was ever found, and 50 years later, the disease still holds as many surprises as when it first appeared. Dr. Oliver Sacks.
From Vladivostok to Vancouver, the disease swept over the world. Or perhaps that's not a good phrase. It's not as if there was a particular movement in a particular direction, but as if 1,000 bonfires got going in different places. The commonest single form were states of sleepiness and torpor, and sometimes as deeper states of coma. And at that time it was impossible to arouse the most deeply affected people. And as it were, they died of sleepiness. At the other extreme, one saw people who had the most extreme insomnia, an absolute inability to sleep. And in fact, this demonstrated for the first time that sleep was a necessity, and that one died if one missed one's sleep for more than 7 to 10 days.
It soon became obvious that sleepy sickness affected posture in a variety of ways. Often they seemed contradictory. Many patients had symptoms like those of Parkinson's disease, tremors and shaking of the limbs. Others were caught or frozen in whatever position they were placed, immobile and statuesque. This condition, described as the rigidity of insanity, had previously only been found in schizophrenics and other deeply disturbed mental patients, and it seemed to support the view that these patients neither conveyed nor felt the feeling of life. They had become as passive as zombies.
Lack of movement or constraint of movement was one sort of picture. One also saw the opposite. One saw violent and explosive movements of all sorts, which a lot of these patients developed. Sometimes there were violent flinging movements, so-called ballistic movements. Sometimes there would be elaborate twisting movements, so-called torsion spasms, athetoses.
What are they?
An athetosis is a writhing movement like this, A torsion spasm is usually something which twists the trunk or the neck in some sort of torturing contortion. One also saw all sorts of impulsive tick-like movements, sudden scratching movements, clearings of the throat, movements which once they had started couldn't be stopped. The patient would scratch himself and couldn't stop, and might have to stop with the other hand or have someone else stop them.
How much did those vary? Were there standard ticks?
No, they varied immensely, and they often tended to vary according to the personality and the circumstances. There was a famous case described in the literature of a man whose first manifestation occurred when he was playing cricket, when he suddenly had to leap up to catch a ball, and he found himself stuck in this position. And thereafter, whenever this particular movement was repeated, it was accompanied by a replay of the feeling that he had to catch a ball.
No two patients ever presented exactly the same picture. It seemed at first as though 1,000 different diseases had broken out. 50 years ago, medical virology was in its infancy, and if sleepy sickness was caused by a virus, it was never isolated. It took 2 years of careful work by the Austrian doctor von Economo to establish that it was a single disease which had attacked the brain.
One tended to see a sort of fusillade of tiny inflammatory lesions in the lower parts of the brain, and sometimes spreading into the spinal cord. But in particular, one would see a very heavy involvement in the midbrain, large pigmented cells which appeared dead black, the substantia nigra. Very interestingly, the highest part of the brain, the cerebral cortex, was usually completely spared. And so that one had the extraordinary situation of people who had all their higher faculties intact, their intelligence and their judgment and their insight and their humor, but who were gripped by extraordinary base disorders of movement, and posture, and appetite, and mood, which they could witness, but do nothing about.
In 1927, sleepy sickness disappeared as suddenly and as mysteriously as it had arrived. The survivors remained, often motionless and speechless, but uniquely aware of their own condition.
Essentially, in the later 1920s and early 1930s and so forth, great numbers of these people were incarcerated in chronic hospitals, lunatic asylums, nursing homes, institutions of one sort and another, and they sort of vanished from social consciousness and from medical consciousness. They were put away. They really became, in a sense, the lepers of the century. One sees again that although there was an enormous volume of interest and writing about these people in the 1920s, that by 1935 it had virtually ceased. And although von Economo wrote at the height of the epidemic, this time it won't be forgotten. It was forgotten.
Many survivors seemed to recover almost completely and return to their former lives, only to develop the symptoms of a premature Parkinson's disease some years later. Gradually, as these symptoms got worse and family and friends could no longer look after them, they were put away in hospitals to join the dwindling number crippled by the epidemic. In 1966, Oliver Sacks arrived to work at Beth Abraham Hospital in New York. Among the patients, Ed Weinthal, now 54. His mother remembers how he fell ill.
He was just graduating high school, and he came home and he says, you know, he says, I can't clench my right hand so well. I said, look at all the books you're carrying, and no wonder, you know, you probably, their hand must have fallen asleep. He says, no, it's about 2 weeks, but I didn't want to worry you. Well, then I started to run from one doctor to another. 7 years it took them to find out what was wrong with him. Well, how old were you, about 22? About 22, I think. 23? 23. So he worked 2 years in City College. He was a library instructor. Then his left side started up. I took a leave of absence, but that was the end of his career. I took care of him for 23 years, and I brought him over here because he started to fall, and he couldn't, I couldn't pick him up. He used to pick himself up, and then he couldn't. And then I got a nervous breakdown, and I had to bring him over here. Because I always says, over my dead body will I put him in an institution, but it was almost so.
Lillian Tighe, at 50, can still manage some light work at the hospital. She carried on a normal life until she felt a tremor in her right leg 20 years ago.
We just kept getting worse and worse. Spread right up the right side, the left side, and then went down to the right side. So I was functioning until about 64. Had my kids in the house. But it got to a place where they were taking care of me instead of me taking care of them. That was too much. So I had to break up the house again.
On his arrival, Sachs brought all the sleepy sickness patients together into one ward.
Hello, Anne. How are you?
He started looking for friends and relatives who had lost touch, and he himself formed with them such relationships as he could.
Okay, goodbye, Lola.
Come on, everybody, move your fingers, out, up, back of your head, in front.
Sachs noticed that although the patient seemed grossly physically disabled, for brief and surprising moments, they could rediscover their lost coordination.
Lola.
In 1967 came the first reports of a spectacular breakthrough. Using a new drug, L-Dopa, Dr. George Coetzee had a resounding success in curing the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Coetzee called L-Dopa the miracle drug of our age. For the first time in 40 years, there was hope at Beth Abram.
One knew that L-Dopa was useful in ordinary Parkinsonism of fairly mild degree and fairly short duration. Here one saw people who had the profoundest disease of the longest duration. Could they be equally helped?
Sachs decided to use L-Dopa, not so much in the expectation of miraculous success, but as a last resort. The condition of many of the patients, now in their 50s and 60s, was deteriorating rapidly. None more so than Lola Rosinski, who was unable to swallow solid food and was threatened with starvation. She was first given L-Dopa in May 1969 in the hope of keeping her alive. It did much more than that.
Lola had been transfixed in a state of extreme, really in a state of infinite Parkinsonism and catatonia for decades. And her change, her awakening, occurred in seconds. And she jumped out of the chair and she flew down the passage and she burst into conversation. And it was an incredible scene. And I would doubt my own memory were it not supported by everyone else's memory, and of course by our accounts and films and so forth, which we took at the time.
And this triumph was repeated time and again during the summer. Esther Prigal, emaciated and stiff, was unable even to turn over in bed. She was considered a terminal patient. After just 3 weeks on L-Dopa, she was able to walk unaided and left the hospital for the first time in years. Ed Weintal was so rigid that he could barely lift a finger. After 2 weeks, he was an active man. At last, he was able to write. Within 20 days, he produced an autobiography of 50,000 words in which he wrote, "With L-Dopa in my blood, there is nothing in the world I can't do." But the most dramatic awakening came in July with Sylvia Schneider. After 35 years in hospital, frozen and inert, she regained the enthusiasm for life which had deserted her 40 years before. But something in her manner was strange. Sachs noted in his diary, "Is it possible that Sylvia has in fact never moved on from the past?"
She was in a marvellous mood for a while, and she was talking away and singing and dancing, but almost everything she said and did had reference to 1926 or before. She referred to figures who were topical at that time. Some of her mannerisms, some of her slang was of a sort which had been obsolete for 40 years. She was, so to speak, a flapper who had come to life.
Sylvia's mood was joyous, elated and salacious. Alone in her room, she sang her favourite songs.
Johnny, come tickle me. You know where underneath my petticoat you find a bunch of hair. If you don't tickle me in the right place, I'll take off my petticoat and piss in your face.
During the summer months, the patients came back to life. Their childish gaiety and enthusiasm shattered the hospital routine.
I felt at the time that it was the most extraordinary scene I'd ever witnessed, and I think perhaps now that I'm unlikely to witness such a scene again in my lifetime. This extraordinariness was felt by everyone, by the patients, and by all of us who worked with them. I mean, at that point, it seemed that there was a real possibility of these incredibly wounded, disabled patients who had been put away for so long. There seemed a real possibility that they might not only come to life again, but perhaps be able to lead full lives. Their reactions were best at that time, and our hopes were highest. I think perhaps our hopes were somewhat exaggerated, but certainly the summer of '69 was a time of elation.
By the autumn of 1969, the first problems had appeared.
It was a sort of Rip Van Winkle or Sleeping Beauty problem. Could a patient whose reality, whose living reality, belonged to 40 or 50 years ago, and who in a sense had been suspended or asleep, I don't mean literally asleep, but in abeyance for 40 or 50 years, could such a patient accommodate to the time gap? Could they understand it? Could they bear it? Or not? In the case of Sylvie, I think she couldn't. And in a very remarkable way, after 10 days of her 1926ness, I think a sort of horror came over her, and shortly after this, she returned to her transfixed, blocked, entranced state, and subsequently nothing we could do, giving her L-Dopa or anything else, would budge her.
Just as in the summer, the patients had delighted in each other's recovery, in the autumn, each setback triggered new disappointments. Just as Lola's awakening had been spectacular, her deterioration was disastrous.
Lola had to face the fact that that she had become much older, that decades of her life had been confiscated. She had to face the fact that she was now in middle age and no longer in her first youth. She had to face the fact that she was in an institution and had been out of the world for years. Perhaps the most painful fact of all for her to face had relation to her family. Lola was an immensely strong person. She is an immensely strong person. Clearly her strength had been the fulcrum of her family. Her ego had held things together. And when she became ill, when she had to go into hospital, the family sort of fell apart. Her daughter became acutely depressed and psychotic. Her son became deeply disturbed and vanished, and her husband became regressed in various ways. And there was a feeling of intense sadness and also of intense guilt which was inflected in which she thought, what have I done? What has my illness done? And this was a very, very torturing period for her.
Each patient in turn found the new life raised doubts and uncertainties from which they had long been shielded by their illness.
Too many of the threads had been broken. Even though they might have been doing well on the drug, to use a phrase of Robert Lowell's, they were still in a limbo of lost connections, social connections, connections with their earlier selves, and it was the magnitude of this limbo, I think, which appalled me in the latter months of '69.
Good health decomposed abruptly. Tics, nightmares and long-forgotten symptoms flourished, apparently independent of the amount of L-Dopa administered. The ward became a bedlam. Sachs was faced with the enigma of a drug which could restore health to Parkinsonian patients after 40 years and yet snatch it away again in weeks.
It seems to me certain, first, that there must be other problems in the Parkinsonian and post-encephalitic brain besides the depletion of dopamine. Because if there was simply a depletion of dopamine, then, so to speak, one could top the people up and they'd be fine, and they could stay topped up in somewhat the same way as one would top up an anemic or top up someone whose thyroid function is lowered. However, one has good evidence for structural damage as well. There has been loss of nerve cells, loss of synapses, loss of neuronal organization, as well as loss of dopamine.
This is why there were difficulties after awakening in so many cases.
Well, I think that the recurrence of the original symptoms goes along with this. The other sort of problem one sees, the so-called side effects, consists of the appearance of peculiar, unwanted, undesirable excitations of one sort and another, abnormal movements, abnormal emotional excitement, and so forth. And this would seem to me to go along with the idea that one can't affect one part of the brain without affecting another part of the brain, any more than you can throw a stone into a pond and not have ripples. I think the idea that one has, that so to speak, one can shoot the Parkinson center of the brain with an absolutely specific drug and not have any other effects is surely a mistake. Whether there's a physical spread of dopamine into other parts of the brain, or whether it's simply a spread of electrical activity and excitation, one doesn't know. But one but one certainly sees a functional spread. One sees this, I think, with all drugs which are designed to alter behavior, whether it's something like L-Dopa, altering Parkinsonism, or the tranquilizers for agitations, or any other sort of legitimate or illegitimate drug. On the one hand, one sees a waning of effect, and on the other, a spreading of effect. And in this sense, sooner or later, the person decomposes, and they lose the effect one wants, and and it becomes difficult or impossible to retrieve it.
Lola! Lola, be sensible. Be sensible. Lola, come here. Look at me.
Today, the effects of L-Dopa are neither as dramatic nor as terrible as they were in 1969, and Lola has survived both the elation and disappointment of the initial treatment. She is no longer speechless or unable to swallow, but her behavior is fragmented and unstable. 20 or 30 times a day, like a yo-yo, she jumps from remorseless activity to a passive, frozen state, in which the slightest move demands intense effort. The patients must adapt to the disconcerting side effects of L-Dopa. Each morning as the drug begins to work, Lillian Tighe's head rocks uncontrollably from side to side.
How are you this morning?
Okay. Fine.
What's it like doing your hair when your head's shaking like that?
It's not bad. Bounces around.
So how do you manage to do it if it bounces around?
Kind of follow it around. Devil putting a part in, though.
What kind of things can't you do when you're like this?
The only thing I don't do, I don't talk so good. I don't hear so good. The rest of me is all right. I can use my hands. Everything's relaxed. I can stand better. I can sit.
How do you manage to read?
Oh, it's all right. The eyeballs go on the paper and the head just goes.
Your eyeballs go on the paper?
Yeah. I can keep my eyes on one thing. All the heads are going.
You find no difficulty at all?
Oh, yes. I lose the place quite a bit.
What happens when it goes away?
The medicine stops working. I go back to shaking again.
At the moment, my medicine isn't working, though.
So, is that why you're shaking a bit?
Shaking, yeah. I concentrate on my hands, my feet go.
By the afternoon, the effect of the drug has faded, and although Lillian can keep her head still, her arms and legs begin to shake.
How do you feel when your head starts rolling?
Weird. Everybody looks. Even the nurses aren't used to it. Because we had a lot of fun with it. She tried to shampoo my hair once. She didn't have to move her hands. My head was moving. She got hysterical.
You feel weird?
Yeah. I know it bothers everybody else. It doesn't bother me too much. But you look in the mirror and you can see what he's doing. Oh, boy.
What do you feel when you look in the mirror and see your head rolling?
I don't look.
As the drug wears off, Lillian, like Lola, freezes in empty spaces.
Empty spaces are weird. You know you can't get across. You're frozen in the middle.
Do you want to move forward?
That's the worst part. You want to move forward, everything moves, but the feet stand still. So if you go try and help you like that, take your elbow, come on. They take me and the feet are still on the floor. They haven't moved. It's like they're glued. You just plant there and there they stay. If you wait long enough, you get your balance back and you can shift back and forth and move. If I stood up straight at that time, I'd fall over backwards. So instead, I get bent over. So I just start to pray and something happens. Feet will go. What else can you do?
You start to pray?
Yeah. Works.
What kind of prayer do you say?
Just a regular, Lord help me. For a while I can move again.
How difficult is it to keep cheerful here?
Not too bad, because most people don't want to get morbid around here. You discuss your illnesses, but you get tired of that. Of course, half the floor can't talk at all.
How well adjusted are you now to your illness?
You never get adjusted. You wake up every morning, it's hard to see it's there.
There's no business like business at all.
Coping both with a disabling disease and their own capricious response to L-DOPA is a lonely struggle. And these days, only the weekly music class can guarantee enthusiastic and active participation. And for Mary Ballas, a break to recall happier times.
When you had the L-DOPA treatment in 1969, did you like music then?
Yes, I love music then.
What happened?
What happened? Nothing happened. Except that I was very, very happy, very, very gay when I first took L-DOPA. I was very, very happy when I first took L-DOPA.
How did you show that you were happy?
And I sure I was happy. I walked around, I stood up straight, and I danced and I sang, and I was very, very happy.
What did you sing?
I sang those old sweet songs. Just a song at twilight, when the lights are low, and the flickering shadows softly come and go. Though the heart be weary, sad the day and long, still to us at twilight comes love's old song, comes love's old sweet song.
That's lovely. When did you learn that?
I learned that a long, long time ago.
Before you came in here?
Before I came in here.
Did L-DOPA affect the way you moved around at all?
Yes, I think it made me a little bit steadier.
I can't hear you.
I think it made me a little bit steadier.
Made you steadier?
Yes.
And when you walked around, did you walk fast or slow? Or...
I walked fast.
How fast?
Oh, I should just about a mile a minute.
What happened after you'd first had L-DOPA?
And after I had L-DOPA, for a week I was very, very happy. I walked around, I sang and I danced, and then I was...
And then what happened? What happened after that first week when you were on L-DOPA?
I fell. I was walking around without a wheelchair, and I fell. And they put me in a wheelchair, and they strapped me in. And I didn't have the freedom that I really wanted.
Did you still feel as happy as you were?
I still feel as happy as I was? No, I didn't feel so happy. There are times when I feel very, very good, and there are times when I don't feel well at all.
Although one has seen certain general effects of L-DOPA, which are common to all patients, over and above this, the reactions have been different in every patient. Every patient reacts according to his own nature and constitution. And one can't understand his reactions unless one understands his nature and constitution. Therefore, I think something like this, which at first seems to recommend itself as a shortcut to therapy, as a way of making individual attention unnecessary or supererogatory, finally forces one back to look at the patient as a particular person.
Esther Prigal has few doubts that L-DOPA has made her life more tolerable.
Well, I think L-DOPA is helping me. I think so. I think without it, if I had no help, then I wouldn't be able to do anything. I wouldn't be able to dress myself or go to the bathroom. You know, that's so important. Maybe it isn't spoken about in polite society, but being able to go to the bathroom by yourself without being taken and lifted, you know, that is a wonderful thing. I'm sure you understand.
When you're having one of your good days nowadays, how do you feel? What do you think about?
Well, I don't like to tell you, but I will. I think, what am I going to do when I get home? Where do I have to go to? No, that's not a very happy thought, but that's the way the thoughts come.
So on your bad days, what do you think about?
I try, if I think of that way on my good days, what do I think on my bad days? Oh dear, I don't know. I haven't had any good days in such a long time. The principal thing, the most important positive thing is visitors. Have your own people, your friends, and your family come to see you. Now, it's wonderful when they come. It's really wonderful. It's like two different worlds.
For some patients, the improvement brought about by L-DOPA has enabled family ties to be restored. For all of them, there is no longer the prospect of a miraculous cure, no longer the emotional peaks and troughs of their early therapy, but at least a coming to terms with their disease. Neglected for 50 years, these last survivors of a long-forgotten epidemic had one brief glimpse of normal life. During it, one of them wrote, "I am a living candle. I am consumed that you may learn. New things will be seen in the light of my suffering."
If there were any simple way of predicting how a patient would react to L-DOPA, then the question of decision would be much easier. I think it is much easier for patients with ordinary Parkinson's disease, who on the whole can expect to have a good reaction and to sustain it for a long time, for several years, with a minimum of complications. With these really extraordinary post-encephalitic patients whom I've seen, the situation is different, because if they have the possibilities of becoming sensationally well for a time, they also have the possibilities and even the probabilities of then getting sensational complications of one sort or another. It finally becomes a sort of wager as to whether it's worth it. It may be, for example, that a month of good life is worth it if one has been effectively dead or asleep for half a century.
Foi a tal.